Hello and welcome to another episode of A View from the Top. I'm Adrian Cropley. A View from the Top is a regular podcast from the Centre for Strategic Communication Excellence, where I get to interview some of the world's leading communication professionals as we explore their career journey. So welcome. Aniisu Verghese, or should I say Dr. Aniisu Verghese, is an award-winning communications professional and host of the acclaimed blog Introscope. He's also the author of Internal Communication Insights, Practices and Models, and is one of our leading internal communication professionals globally. Currently based in Poland, Aniisu works as a director for corporate communications. Welcome, Aniisu. It's great to have you on board. And finally, we get to have a view from the top.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Appreciate including me in your show. I'm delighted to be part of this.
It's great to have you here, and we were talking a little bit before the show about that move from India to Poland, and obviously this time of the year it's quite chilly.
Yeah, it is extremely cold for us, at least my family and I are really somehow hoping that we survive the winter.
Well, that's great. We talk about going into hibernation when it comes to winter, and you just bravely go right into it. So, from an Australian context, I admire anybody that lives in a climate that's so cold, but a beautiful country nonetheless. I think what a wonderful place to live. Listen, you've worked for some of the big brands in the world, organizations like Tesco, Sapient, Accenture, to name three of them. You've worked in a number of organizations. And so I'm really looking forward to exploring your career. But I have to say, I'm more than a little intrigued about your PhD, which you completed in 2021. To become a doctor in philosophy, which I think is great. And I almost want every internal communication practitioner to do this, because I'm sure this has really helped you. But there's a communication link, right, in that doctorate that you did. What was all of that about?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, it definitely a fantastic experience. And I'm really delighted that I managed to get through the PhD, because I was doing this while I was working, so it's obviously much harder than doing it as a standalone PhD. So my PhD was on communication satisfaction, and I looked at how knowledge workers can go over and above at the workplace if they are able to identify with the organization, and is there a linkage to how communication can influence their effort. So I think that was really what I studied, and I did obviously a mixed method interviews and obviously a quantitative kind of study, and what I gathered was that there is definitely a strong linkage to how communication satisfaction, and especially some of the components of it, especially culture and line manager support, can drive some of these behaviors. And therefore, there's a very important linkage to practice. And the reason why I did this PhD was because I wanted to bridge the gap between theory and practice. And that's often the gap that we see at the workplace as well, where companies would like to bring in a lot of interesting practices, but then they really don't understand the theory and the consequences of doing them and not fully understanding what can happen at the workplace if they don't understand the background and theory of it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you bring that up, because organizations are always prone to thinking they know the best for communication, isn't it? And they just kind of pull it up from left of field and go, oh yeah, I think this is important, or let's try that. But to actually ground it in the research and the theory is just so very important, isn't it?
Right, absolutely. And I think that's, there's a lot more investment required. And I would really recommend that organizations have their team members read up a lot of the literature that's happening there, because there's a lot of interesting work which is getting done in internal comms and other areas. And many communicators really don't understand or know that it's out there, and you can really draw brilliant insights from it and put that into practice.
Mm. And it plays that role of research, particularly in our work. I mean, obviously, as a leading light and thought leader in internal communication, research plays an important role that supports people's careers. Getting ahead in an organization is really about understanding the insight that you provide an organization as an internal communication professional.
Right,
The
absolutely.
the the thing I'd like to explore is I'm going to take you back a little way now to talking about your career. Where did it really start for you in communication? I mean, was communication something you always wanted to do, or was it something you kind of landed in?
Well, yeah, I was always passionate about writing. I was always passionate about curating content, and all through school, all through college, I was involved in some form or the other, either in the literary and arts and drama and all of that. And those areas kind of shaped how I looked at communication in the future. But what's interesting was I also had a hobby called DXing, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it. D stands for distance, and X stands for unknown. It's more about communicating with radio stations from around the world. So I used to listen to a lot of radio, and Radio Australia was one of my favorite stations back then. Radio News, Radio Netherlands, Voice of America, Radio France International, you just name it. I used to listen to all these radio stations, and the way these radio stations engaged was that they always invited listeners to send in something called a QSL card, which is more to help them understand whether their reach and frequency is appropriate. And they used to send back some interesting, snippets of either the radio station or the country, and it was a great way to understand the culture. So my linkage to communication did go back a long way back, but I was also I started my career in advertising, and my first job was in Bangladesh, and I had the huge opportunity to work with some brilliant brands like Nestle and British American Tobacco and Tata Tea and some of these great brands. Um, and in those days, of course, when you work in advertising, you really, if you're very junior in the department and the organization, you don't get to work on some of the bigger portfolios. But I was given a free hand, and that really helped open my mind as to what are the possibilities, and getting the experience of working with clients, account management, creative, all of that. So I think my linkage to communication, and of course my starting point was advertising, and that's how I began. And then I moved into corporate communication to discover the broader spectrum of how it all works.
I mean, it's fascinating. You must have felt like you were really handed a gift, having a little bit of a more scope to your role very early in your career.
Yeah. So, in fact, one of the so while I was doing advertising, I also got to learn about product packaging. I got to create a TV program working with some of the leading Bangladeshi stars, and that was broadcast from Singapore. So I did a whole range of initiatives which helped me understand the depth of what advertising as well as what communication can do.
And it's interesting. I guess you got your passion very early in the piece around working globally, because your impact globally is absolutely fabulous. In terms of your understanding, particularly around the different cultures. So obviously that early exposure has helped you immensely. If you think about some of the roles that you did, when did you discover internal communication? Because that's been, and corporate communication, because that's been a big part of your life. So how did you get into that, and when did you kind of realize that this was a passion piece for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, like I said, once I kind of got a hang of what advertising was, I realized that it was just a small piece of the broader corporate communication agenda, and I really wanted to explore a lot more. And an opportunity came from Oracle, and those days it was called iFlex Solutions, and which was bought over by Oracle. And there was an opportunity to manage the internal communication, that is the intranet, newsletter, employee engagement activities, and all of that. And I raised my hand and said, I'll give this a shot. And at those days, people told me, hey, you're making a mistake of getting into internal communications. And I'm talking about way back in 2000. They said, hey, you won't get paid well, you won't be visible, you won't get, the kind of, reputation that you need. But I stuck to my guns because I was quite passionate about that area. I realized that the potential and the immense power it had, both internally and externally, because, those days, no one really even thought of employees as ambassadors and advocates of the brand. And so I kind of explored further. I continued doing internal comms for many, many years, and I still continue to do it. But I think that was, I would say life changing for me, because it kind of opened my eyes as to the possibilities. And what was interesting is in 2006, I started my blog, Intrascope, and uh, because there was no one writing about it in India, and there were students and professionals who were writing and asking me, saying, if you have any insights on this topic, can you share it? And I started blogging on that topic. And in 2012, a publisher reached out and said, hey, look, there is no such book on the subject, at least in India. Why didn't you author something? And I said, why not? And I gave it, I put together all the material I could gather. And that's how the first book came out in 2012.
It was that's if you think of the context, and so for a lot of our listeners, the context is internal comms was still very, very much in its infancy when you think back to those days. So I know, and you say in India, but generally globally, it was not an advanced profession then. I mean, when we look at internal comms now. So, one of the pioneers of in internal communications, and I look at that context. There was very few of us in the world at that time that was doing internal comms, and it was a very brave step into it, because there was that pushback that, oh, really, do you want to do internal comms? It's just the person that does the newsletter, or yes, you like writing, but it's a bit of a side communication issue. But boy, has it evolved over the years, and you've
Absolutely.
seen some huge changes in internal communication. You've been part of leading some of those changes. What have you, and this is kind of a left of field question, but what have you observed over the years around the maturity of internal comms specifically? What have you seen some of the big changes?
Yeah, I think if I look back and see even the number of jobs and opportunities there are in internal comms, it's fantastic to see the kind of organizations investing in this particular domain and looking for professionals and talent in this particular space. Because back then it was considered that, hey, someone who would probably be in events or in PR would kind of move into this domain and do internal comms as an add-on to their already broader role which they had. But I think that was one big shift. So I see that the organizations and even leaders have started investing a lot more, in fact trusting and respecting internal communications a lot more. And of course, with the pandemic, that has been heightened, because now internal communicators are almost very strategic and trusted advisors to leaders in whichever organization who wants to advance their agenda and their corporate narrative. So I really see a huge change and a huge shift in terms of how internal comms is now currently perceived and viewed, and the number of trainings and certifications which have come up along the way. I think that also clearly indicates that the function is matured. I can recollect in 2011, I was invited by the IABC to speak at the World Conference in Chicago and in San Diego. And because of the fact that I was writing about this topic, and they felt that there was something I could add value to the conference. And that was something which, opened my eyes, saying that, hey, I didn't realize that there were other people out there who would be interested to listen to what I do, and the kind of work that we are doing out of Asia. And I think those days Asia was also not considered as in geography, which did a lot of great internal comms work. So yeah, I think there's been tremendous change, and it's fascinating, and I'm very glad that I could contribute in some form to that journey.
Yeah, and I must admit, as you talk about that conference in San Diego in 2011, I remember it very, very well. I was chair of IABC at that time, and that was my outgoing conference, and
Oh,
but to see those changes in internal comms, even over that short time, and it was really coming into its own. But what were some of the roles that you did that you felt kind of pushed your career forward in internal communication? So was there a moment or a couple of roles that maybe that you did that really elevated your work in internal comms?
yeah, I think a few key initiators, because I know at those days a lot of organizations are struggling with engaging and connecting their team members, and of course, intranets were very heavily involved in helping organizations do that job of at least getting everyone on the same page. So, I've worked with multiple organizations on defining what the strategy would be for their internal social networks, and creating and curating and launching some of these intranets, maintaining them, engaging staff and leaders to be part of this entire journey of So I think that was one big piece of work that which really helped me understand, and also helped me shape some of the way organizations were thinking about or engaging their staff. The other was more to do with ESG and CSR, because in those days, of course, it was known as corporate social responsibility. And along with the internal comms role, I also did get a chance to work on corporate social responsibility as a portfolio. And I've soon discovered that it was such a brilliant engagement tool, because if staff are contributing their time and effort beyond their usual work hours and beyond the usual work schedule, there was something which was helping connect them back to the company's purpose, and making them feel more engaged and aligned with the company. And when I started engaging on CSR, and I could see that the opportunities for internal and external and some of those boundaries were blurring, and I felt that there was again a huge need and opportunity for internal communicators to think boundaryless. I mean, you can't be thinking that you only have a siloed portfolio of work, and you can't think of what's happening in the outside world, because you have employees sharing stuff, and you have the opportunity to take some of the stories and make it really amplify it in some form or the other. So I think those are some of the few areas which I felt which made the engagement really strong, and it kind of helped shape how communication was done back then, and I think as we move forward now.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, those observations in your career as you've moved through, and the topics that we're dealing with in internal communications, you can see that where internal communications has come into its own. So it's really about that expanding engagement piece. And I mean, you would have noticed as well that continually blurring of the lines between internal and external, and the ESG space, particularly.
Right.
Is where those lines are really blurred, but it's all about that purpose-driven organizations, and then what brings both your employees and customers into an organization.
Absolutely.
If we think about your career, what tips would you share with communication professionals to how they can demonstrate value in the work that they do in their organizations? So, you've made it to the top table in organizations that you've worked. What would be some of those tips you would share to getting to that top table?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the first one would be to be seen and be heard as an expert, because when you are able to add when you are an expert and you are able to add value, leaders and managers would really see how you're contributing, and that's when you can do more, and you'll be invited to those conversations where they are struggling with everyday challenges of communication. So I think the first step is to invest in yourself to become an expert. So you need to become a champion in the space and be really passionate about what you're doing, and that should be really what attracts leaders and managers to come to you. And of course, even within the communications team, you should be a mentor for others so that they can also get better with what they're doing. So that's one part. The other is always to constantly strive to look at better and more ways of making your stakeholders succeed. So it's not just being happy with what you have delivered in the last campaign, but what can you do going forward? What are some of the continuous improvements that you can keep doing in terms of the processes, in terms of the systems, in terms of how team members can engage? I think that's very crucial, because then you are seen as someone who is going over and above, who's constantly thinking about the next normal. So that's really very crucial for success. And the third part, element would be need to keep track of the value and the progress you're making. And this could be done through various ways. You could have a dashboard that you maintain and you report out, but unless stakeholders can see visibly the impact and value you're adding, it will never really register that comms can add value. You need to constantly show that there is a clear line of sight to business goals, and it needs to be always connected so that leaders understand the value of communication. So I think there's a responsibility of communicators, internal communicators especially, to keep highlighting this, so that you can demonstrate your expertise, and leaders and managers see you as trusted advisor to their work.
Brilliant. And it's some very wise tips there that you've shared with communication professionals in general. I mean, really, it's not just internal communications. We can apply this right across the disciplines of communication in terms of how we add that value and become that trusted advisor. Before I let you go today, I can't help but think, you share many thoughts, and you're very good at understanding the trends of internal communications, where that is heading. And at the end of 2022, you wrote or partly wrote an article for Popolo, and talked about what's some of your predictions for 2023? So, we're here, if we look at this year, 2023 and beyond, where do you see our profession in internal communications going?
Well, yeah. So I think what I see, and especially after the pandemic, organizations are struggling with managing their remote work, remote staff, and how to kind of get people back to the office has become such a valuable topic. But I don't think that's really as important as how can you connect them to the purpose, and how can you go back to the basics of culture, values. I think that's fundamentally what will help organizations move forward, and also help connect staff, in terms of how they want to engage. Fundamentally, I'm also a strong believer that all your employees are your biggest ambassadors and advocates, and unless you invest in their personal brands in some sense, they will not be able to promote the brand of the company as well. So it's a mutual give and take, and I think it's important for organizations to start realizing the value employees can add as brand ambassadors. And I've been talking about this at various events and conferences, where I clearly call out that employees are your partners. They are not your audience. So you need to involve them as your partners when you communicate. So that would mean you have to invite them into the process of communication, involve them when you in terms of their ideas, and also in terms of executing some of the programs that you do. And I've seen this work really well in some organizations where we've created an extended arm of the comms team, which we call informally like a brand council, where employees who have certain skill sets, be it writing, design, art, drama, theater, anything, they could bring that skill to the table, and the comms team could work with them to make communication unique, very engaging, so that all employees appreciate what's happening. Because usually, if it's coming from the company, it's perceived as corporate speak, and it's not really valued as much. So I think some of these are how I think the future would can be enhanced if we start thinking of employees as partners. And that's what I see as a trend which should be picked up by organizations going forward.
I really love that concept of seeing employees as partners. It kind of, we've, as you said, we've often talked about brand ambassadorship with employees, but I think it has evolved from that. Really, it's being that true partner in the organization. And when you hear things like "we, the organization," I often listen for language and how people describe their organization, and you can tell when they're committed and passionate about their organization because they refer to it as "we," being the organization.
Right.
Rather than they, the company that I work for. And I think that's a really important measure. Aniisu, it's been absolutely fabulous talking to you today and for you sharing your career. Is there any other tips or points you would want to leave before we finish our conversation today for communication professionals?
Well, I think one ask I would have of communicators and professionals in this space is that there's a responsibility that all of us have to also help others, our peer group, and youngsters who are thinking about communication as their careers, and try to mentor them, because I feel there's a huge need and a big gap there. Lots of professionals struggle, and I have many of them reach out through LinkedIn and other sources to me, and I'm sure many others, to understand how they can build their careers, how they can think of their future, how can they improve their skills and capabilities. But I'm not sure they are getting as much value or as many people to give them the right kind of guidance. So I think there's a responsibility for all of us to do our bit, and you could do your bit either by sparing some time to mentor informally, or writing something like an article or a blog, or even being part of a forum like IBC, where people could contribute and give back in some form or the other. So that's really my request and ask, so that we can make our community thrive.
I think that's a great ask, and what a gift to give to be able to support, mentor, coach up and coming communication professionals. And I think because we are in it together, we're raising value for our whole profession. I think that's a wonderful gift. Aniisu, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a lovely conversation, and can I say thank you for all you do for our profession? You really do go over and above to mentor others, to share your knowledge and wisdom. And I really encourage our listeners to look at Interscope, the blog, and tap into your podcast and some of the articles that you write. That's great information, and it's so supportive of our profession.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Appreciate it.
It's great having you, and I hope we get to talk again.
Absolutely.
Okay, and thank you everyone for tuning in to A View from the Top this episode, and look forward to hearing or seeing and connecting with you all again in our next episode.